Welcome back. I'm a big fan of affordable dress watches, and when I say affordable, I mean truly affordable, not affordable in quotes, which is why I'm a big fan of the Orient Bambino. There's a whole variety of styles, and they're all well under $200. But what's more important is that they all look great, and they punch way above that in terms of quality and feel. Most people tend to fall in love with their Bambino, but not everyone is a fan. If you prefer something a little smaller, and maybe a little more classically styled, like say a Rolex Datejust, then that's one area where the Bambino falls short. However, I was recently introduced to another Orient that is a much better fit for that, and that is the Orient Tri-Star Deneb. Now, this watch was originally given to me to review by Tus Watches, and Tus Watches is a retailer in the UK who specialize in Orients. Originally, they left a comment on my Alpinist video months ago, and I've actually been talking to them about all things Orient since then. And by talking, I mean I've been constantly bugging them with questions about the Orient Star divers. But they're very knowledgeable, very friendly, and they've been putting up with me. So when they asked if I was interested in reviewing the Deneb, I said yes. It really has one of the best dials I've seen at this price. And I'd say the style is kind of a mix of 70s Japan and a Rolex Datejust, which sounds kind of odd, but I think will make much more sense once you take a closer look at it. First off, let's talk about that 3-star or Tri-Star branding. Basically, it's Orient's entry-level line, and pretty similar to the Seiko 5 watches from Seiko. So if you're familiar with those, these are going to have a similar price and similar movement. Although one difference I noted with this specific Tri-Star is in the size. Most of those Tri-Star and Seiko 5 dress watches are going to be smaller at 37mm, whereas the Deneb here is sitting right at 39. So it's going to be in between those and the 40.5mm Bambinos. And as always, that's without the crown, with you're looking at just under 42mm. And you also have a rather short lug-to-lug here of 44.4. So you're looking at a rather compact platform, and one that's also fairly thin at 11.2mm. So overall, it's a good size for a dress watch. It's one that's big enough to make an impact, but not so big that it ever gets in the way. Rounding out the specs, you have Orient's in-house F4 902 movement, as well as a weight of about 65 grams with its bracelet. There's also a rather minimal water-resistant rating of 30 meters, but best of all, a 20mm lug width. So unlike the 21mm Bambino, there are a ton of aftermarket straps and bracelets to throw on this one. And you're probably going to want to utilize that and swap out this bracelet, but we'll talk more about that later. As you would expect from an Orient, the overall finish punches above its weight class. Practically every inch of the Deneb has a nice mirror polish to it, with the exception being the brushed closed case back. To me, the overall case shape here has a bit of a 70s vibe to it. It's very sleek and flows organically from lug to lug. Looking from the top down, the case may seem rather simple, but it's a bit more complex than that. Now, as reflective as this thing is, it might be kind of hard to see in these shots. But looking from the side, there are actually 6 different polished sections that lead from the case back all the way up to the crystal. And they each reflect light at just a slightly different angle. Leading up from the case back, you have a small curved lip that then goes to the side of the case, which then leads to a beveled edge that runs from lug to lug before hitting the top of the case. And from there, there's a small polished vertical ridge just before you get to the top of the bezel. It's really well done and just beautiful to look at. Now, most of the Seiko 5 dress watches you'll run into have a very small and recessed crown, sitting about the 4 o'clock position. And while this does keep it nicely out of the way, I've always found them a pain to use. However, here with the Deneb, the crown is sitting right at the 3, which visually I do prefer for a dress watch. The crown is a little bit small, but proportionally it looks good. And you do still have to use a fingernail to pop it out, but it is pretty easy to use after that. Although this does lead into my biggest issue with the Deneb, and it's not so much the crown as the movement it's attached to. The Deneb uses Orient's F4902 movement. Now, it's an automatic movement with a standard beat rate, as well as a 40-hour power reserve, as well as a quickset day and date complication. But there's no hacking here and no hand winding. Now, at this price, is this really an issue? Well, sort of. The thing is, at this price, you never really get everything you want. And this movement is on par with the Seikos 7S26, which is going to wind up being in most of those Seiko 5 dress watches. However, Orient already has a number of other options, and that does include the Bambino, and those are going to have a newer movement. Not to mention, there are a ton of off-brand Chinese watches out there, and those are going to use a Seiko or a Miyota movement that doesn't have this limitation. So it kinda is and it kinda isn't, just depends on your point of view about it. Now, one other thing I did notice is that the rotor on this is a little bit loud. It's not Seiko kinetic loud, but I think it's a little bit louder than a Miyota. And overall, it didn't really bother me throughout the day, but it was definitely something I noticed. So the movement here is a little bit of a compromise. But to be fair, so are most watches at this price. And considering just how popular Seiko 5s are, it's a compromise that a lot of people are willing to accept. So just something to think about here. Now, as far as the crystal goes, it's just a simple flat mineral, which is normal and even expected from a name brand company at this price. And as far as I can tell, there isn't any anti-reflective coating on it. But even without that, I thought the dial was still beautifully clear at most angles. And I could easily see this being a watch that modders buy just to upgrade with a domed sapphire crystal. But let's move on to the real star of the show here, which is the dial. And with this particular colorway, it has a deep royal sunburst blue effect to it, which is then mixed with rose gold indices and hands for a very striking combination, and one that offers a lot of contrast and usability. For me, the overall layout here is a bit Rolex Datejust, as you have applied bars as indicators that are then combined with painted dashes as a chapter ring. Although Orient then modifies that by throwing in lume dots just on the inside of those indicators, which to me is a bit 70s, or at the very least reminds me of Orient's Neo 70s chrono. I believe the indicators are applied, but they're not very tall, so not a whole lot of depth on this one. But there's a lot of other visually interesting elements here just to keep your eyes constantly fixed, such as the applied logo at the top with just a splash of red and the 3 stars at the bottom. There's also the day date complication at the 3. Now, if you wear this every day, I think it's something you could appreciate. But I know there are plenty of other people out there who think a dress watch shouldn't have a date at all. For me, I'm perfectly fine with it as long as it doesn't disrupt the flow of the dial. But here with this white border, I think it does just that. So I think it would have been better if they left it off and just had a simple cutout. Now the hands are simple sticks that are also in rose gold, but they have a thin white lume center that runs down each, which I think adds to the overall contrast and matches the lume dots on the dial. Overall, it's just a gorgeous dial, and one that's very effective and easy to use. Although I can't help but think that the logo, the text, and that date, well, they take up a lot of dial real estate, and make the dial seem a little bit crowded. Now, the lume technically exists, but it's not very potent. In fact, I think the lume paint here is more for decoration and just add contrast to the overall design. And considering that this is a dress watch, that's perfectly fine. But as always, I did throw it into a comparison. And here you can see that the hands fade out about the same time as my AliExpress Cadison watch. So they don't last very long. But interestingly, the lume dots on the dial do, which is kinda cool, but not very useful without the hands. But let's move on to the bracelet. And I guess I could say that it's perfectly acceptable for its price, but it doesn't impress much. If you happen to get one of these, you might as well try it out. But if you're like me, you'll take it off pretty soon after that. While it has a good look, I think it does have a cheaper feel to it, as it has folded links, folded end links, and a pressed clasp. And all of that leads to it being a bit rattly as it moves around. I'm also not entirely a fan of the mostly brushed end links that then mixes with an entirely polished case. Although that's not the worst of it. The one thing I can't really forgive is that instead of pins, it uses this system where you push out the entire side of the link. Now, I can't remember the name of this, but it's something I've used before, and absolutely hated it. So this is one instance I didn't even bother removing any links. I just used the micro adjustment holes to fit it to my wrist to at least try it out, and then quickly swapped it out. Although regardless of what strap or bracelet you wind up using with this, I found it pretty comfortable. It's very lightweight and a beautiful presence. And I think because of these curved slender lugs and that shorter lug to lug, the Deneb actually wears a little smaller than it is. Right now on Tus Watches, the price is £90, which is about 110 US. And if you're looking for comparables, all you have to do is look at the Orient Bambinos and some of the Seiko SNK dress watches. Now the Seiko SNKs are going to be a little bit smaller, but have a movement that's about the same, whereas the Bambinos will be a little bit larger, but have a newer movement with hacking and hand winding. The trick with all of these is that their prices are always in flux, so it's really hard to say what the best bang for your buck is going to be at any given point in time. You really just have to look and shop around and see what you find. Now, I think it goes without saying that I wish this had a better movement, something like the Bambinos, but at its price, I think that's forgivable. So if you are in the market for a truly affordable dress watch, the Deneb is one you should check out. But let me know down below what you think about the Orient Tri-Star Deneb. And if you'd like to see me do a comparison video with this and say a Bambino, or maybe even a specific SNK, let me know that as well. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.